At nearly 80, Barry Gibb no longer stands beneath the blazing lights of packed arenas. Nor does anyone share the microphone beside him anymore. The seaside home in Miami, once filled with the laughter of four Gibb brothers, now echoes with a single voice. That same voice that once made the world dance, once taught broken hearts to believe in love again. But today, it sings for those who are gone. People call him the soul of the Bee Gees, the genius of the falsetto, the man who defined disco. Yet when the lights fade, Barry is simply a survivor. The last one still able to hear the harmonies the world has forgotten. He wrote, "How deep is your love?" To speak of faith in love, to love somebody for someone he could never have, and staying alive, to remind himself that even when the world collapses, he must go on living. Because behind every note lies a story of fire, of blood, of brothers who fell before him, and of a heart that keeps beating even when there's no one left to sing along. Barry Gibb, who wrote the melodies of a century, now lives with the silence of three departed brothers. And within that silence, he still sings, as if every song could keep them alive just a little longer. Perhaps the hardest part of losing everything is having to keep living, remembering every single thing you've lost. But before the world ever knew the name Barry Gibb, there was once a small, thin, and quiet boy, a child who grew up amid poverty, fear, and the web of burn scars that covered his skin. Barry was born in 1946 on the Isle of Man, where sea winds swept through old houses, and his father, Hugh Gibb, played drums in small bars to feed the family. His mother, Barbara, was a woman strong enough to hold the family together with nothing but her belief that her children would not always live in hardship. When Barry was only 2, an accident that seemed trivial nearly cost him his life. The curious boy pulled down a boiling kettle from the stove and suffered severe burns. Doctors said he might not survive the night, but he did, through pain, panic, and then silence. The hospital room, the smell of antiseptic, and the long nights without his parents etched themselves deep into his memory. From that moment on, Barry was no longer a noisy child. He became quiet, wary, and always carried the sense that safety was the most fragile thing in the world. The Gibbs were so poor that they had to move constantly, from the Isle of Man to Manchester, from one cramped apartment to another makeshift home. His father, a wandering musician, was often exhausted from scarce gigs. Yet one thing was never missing in that household: music. On rainy nights, when the wind howled through the windows, Hugh would bring out his drums and play a few beats, while little Barry, just 3 or 4 years old, sat beside him, listening in awe. The sounds of the drums, the guitar, and his parents' warm, humble singing planted in him one unshakable belief: music was the language of life. Then came post-war Britain. Unemployment spread, and the Gibbs were forced to move again, this time on the longest journey of all, to Australia, where they hoped for a new beginning. In 1958, 12-year-old Barry arrived in Queensland with no money, no friends, and no clear future. But there he found what would define his entire life: brotherhood and music. Barry, Robin, and Maurice, along with their sister Leslie, began singing anywhere people would listen: markets, fairs, even the Redcliffe Speedway, where they competed for spare change from distracted spectators. One night, when their backing tape broke mid-performance, Barry was forced to sing live. His clear, slightly raspy teenage voice silenced the noisy crowd. For the first time, he felt he could do something more than just survive. From that moment on, music was no longer a hobby. It was survival. Barry began to write songs, not for fame, but to express the things he couldn't say aloud: fear, pain, and a longing for safety. He wrote in the dark, practiced guitar with scarred hands, taught his younger brothers harmony, and dreamed of escaping poverty. None of them knew then that those poor Gibb boys, who once sang through dust and engine noise, would one day become immortal icons of world music. But for Barry, from the very beginning, music was never a dream. It was the only way to stay alive. In 1958, as Britain was still reeling from post-war hardship and poverty, the Gibb family made the boldest decision of their lives: to leave everything behind and start anew on the other side of the world. They boarded the fair sea, bound for Australia, carrying little more than a few suitcases of worn clothes, a guitar, and a fragile belief that the promised land might rescue them from endless struggle. The voyage lasted weeks, cramped, sweltering, and filled with the cries of restless children. But when the ship finally docked, what awaited them was no paradise. Just a blistering, dusty suburb where immigrants packed into makeshift houses under the harsh Queensland sun. Yet it was there, in the red-dusted afternoons of Redcliffe, that the three brothers, Barry, Robin, and Maurice, first began to sing. They performed anywhere that would take them: open-air markets, small theaters, and especially the Redcliffe Speedway, where the crowd paid more attention to the roaring engines than to the music. The boys stood amid gasoline fumes and clattering engines, trying to raise their voices above the chaos. One night, when their backing tape jammed mid-show, Barry took the risk of singing live. His trembling, emotional voice silenced the crowd. For the first time, people listened, not out of curiosity, but because they were moved. From that moment, the brothers knew they had found something that might save them from a life of obscurity. They called themselves the Bee Gees, short for Brothers Gibb, a secret vow that even if the world didn't need them, they would always have each other. The name, chosen just to look catchy on posters, would one day become a symbol of an entire generation of music. Between 1963 and 1966, the Bee Gees began to gain recognition in Australia. They signed with Festival Records and released Spicks and Specks. Its simple melody, tinged with a melancholy beyond their years, shot to the top of local charts. It wasn't just a hit. It was proof that three poor immigrant boys could create something lasting. Barry, barely 17, had already become the creative heart of the group. He wrote as if time itself might steal away his only chance. Each song, a confession, a fragment of memory, a desperate reach for existence. But local success wasn't enough. Barry felt the limits of Australia's small music scene, and the fire inside him refused to settle. In 1967, the Bee Gees decided to return to England, where music was exploding with the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and The Who. It was a risky homecoming, but also their one shot to prove that what they carried wasn't just catchy pop. It was soul. Fortune smiled when they met Robert Stigwood, the famed manager who had worked with Cream and Eric Clapton. Stigwood saw in Barry not just a voice, but a strategist, a songwriter who understood how to reach the human heart. Under his guidance, the Bee Gees quickly rose to prominence. New York mining disaster, 1941, hit the radio, and many listeners mistook it for a Beatles song. That misunderstanding, ironically, catapulted them to fame. Soon came a string of hits: To Love Somebody, Massachusetts, Words, songs that blended soul with pop, tender yet haunting. The world hailed them as the heirs to the Beatles. But inside the group, pressure was mounting. Success had come too fast, and cracks began to form between the brothers. Robin, with his pure, trembling voice, began to feel overshadowed by Barry, who now controlled the songwriting and studio direction. Recording sessions became battlegrounds. Robin wanted solo moments. Barry insisted on unity. Maurice, the gentle twin, tried to mediate, but no one would yield. Behind the polished harmonies of albums like Idea, 1968, and Odessa, 1969, were shouting matches and slammed studio doors. At times, Robin walked out mid-session. The public had no idea that behind their seamless harmonies lay nights of silence between brothers. Yet that tension produced strangely beautiful music. Songs more sorrowful, more introspective, touched by a loneliness rare in 1960s pop. For Barry, each song became therapy, a way to hold the family together. He believed that as long as they kept writing and singing, they wouldn't lose the bond forged in poverty and shared dreams. But the world is never as simple as a melody. The Bee Gees were entering the brightest light of their career, and with it, a shadow that crept in quietly, almost unseen. By the time they returned to England, the music scene was at fever pitch. The three long-haired, velvet-clad dreamers stepped into their first golden age. In 1967, Bee Gees' first was released, marking a new chapter in pop history. Songs like To Love Somebody, New York Mining Disaster, 1941, and Holiday carried a melancholy beauty, music that didn't just please the ear, but touched something deep inside. The album conquered both Britain and America, placing them alongside giants like the Beatles and the Hollies. But as fame spread across both sides of the Atlantic, imbalance grew within. Barry, the main songwriter, the frontman, became the undeniable center. His genius was unquestionable. He understood rhythm, structure, emotion, how to make people weep through melody. Yet, that brilliance cast a long shadow. Robin, with his fragile, emotional voice, longed to be seen as the second soul of the Bee Gees, not just the echo behind his brother. By 1968, with the release of Idea, the rift was clear. I Started a Joke, one of the most haunting ballads of the era, topped charts in over 20 countries. Fans wept at Robin's voice, but behind the scenes, silence had replaced laughter. Barry demanded control. Robin demanded recognition. Maurice still tried to hold them together, but the gap was too wide. In 1969, the fracture broke open. Robin left to pursue a solo career, shocking the world. The Bee Gees, once the pride of the Gibb family, were down to two. Barry and Maurice carried on under the old name and released Cucumber Castle, a project they poured their hearts into. But it failed miserably, both critically and commercially. The glory days turned to humiliation. The press called them the brothers who couldn't get along, likening them to Oasis decades later. Brilliant, but cursed by ego and hurt. The brothers didn't speak for nearly a year. Robin sank into the loneliness of solo fame. Barry buried himself in the studio. Maurice sat alone, staring at old photos from their Redcliffe days. The divine harmony that once entranced the world had dissolved into silence. Then, in 1970, almost by fate, they found themselves together again in a studio. No apologies, no promises, just a shared glance that said everything. They began to play, to write, to sing, and to cry. Something changed after that. The Bee Gees' music grew quieter, deeper, seasoned by pain. In 1971, they released Trafalgar, an album that sounded like both confession and reconciliation. Its centerpiece, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, became their first U.S. #1 hit. A gentle, mournful ballad whose harmonies seemed to dissolve into air. It was a song of healing, not only about romantic heartbreak, but about the broken heart of brotherhood itself. The success of Trafalgar brought the Bee Gees back to the charts and back to themselves. Out of fracture and loss, they found a new kind of humanity in their music. And though the wounds never fully healed, they understood now that music was the only way to say what words never could, and to hold on to each other at least one more time. After the deeply emotional success of Trafalgar, the Bee Gees entered the 1970s as men who had grown wiser after the storm. But music, like their lives, never stood still. By 1972, the trio decided to change direction, shifting from romantic pop toward the rising tide of American R&B. Their 1974 album, Mr. Natural, marked this transition, a blend of soul, funk, and pop infused with the restless energy of New York streets. Though sales were modest, it became a turning point. During those sessions, Barry began experimenting with his now famous falsetto, a strange, soaring sound that would later define the disco era. No one realized that from those half-accidental vocal experiments, he was creating a revolution in popular music. By 1975, the miracle happened. Main Course was released, and everything changed. Under producer Arif Mardin, the Bee Gees reinvented themselves from classic pop craftsmen into the vanguard of a new era, the era of disco. Jive Talking and Nights on Broadway exploded onto the charts, spreading from Miami dance floors to New York, London, and beyond. The driving guitars, pulsing bass lines, and Barry's electrifying falsetto created a sound that was seductive, hypnotic, and liberating. Critics and audiences alike agreed. Barry Gibb had reached the realm of genius, the man who turned rhythm into language and disco into culture. He was hailed as the Mozart of disco, not for showmanship, but for his ability to translate human emotion, joy, sorrow, loneliness, desire, into universal melody. In 1976, the Bee Gees continued their momentum with Children of the World. You Should Be Dancing became a global sensation, igniting dance floors everywhere. Open-collar shirts, glittering lights, and endless grooves turned disco into the new religion of youth. But the true pinnacle came in 1977, when the Bee Gees were asked to compose the soundtrack for Saturday Night Fever. No one could have guessed it would become one of the greatest moments in popular music history. The Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, with songs like Staying Alive, Night Fever, and How Deep Is Your Love, sold over 40 million copies and won Album of the Year at the 1978 Grammys. That year, the Bee Gees achieved an unprecedented feat: 5 consecutive #1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100. They were no longer just a band. They were a phenomenon. Every radio, club, and dance floor echoed their sound. John Travolta became a movie icon, and Barry Gibb, with his curls, beard, and calm smile, became the face of an era. Yet, glory never comes free. Behind the blinding lights were sleepless nights, exhaustion, and an almost suffocating isolation. Barry, who carried the weight of writing and producing nearly everything, slipped into mild depression. Amid the applause and camera flashes, he felt hollow, as if every compliment was just a thin veil over his fatigue. The price of fame, as always, was solitude. Even so, the Bee Gees pressed on. Between 1978 and 1979, they released Spirits Having Flown, one of the most polished works of their career. Tragedy, Too Much Heaven, and Love You Inside Out each topped the charts, solidifying their reign as the royalty of disco. By 1980, the Bee Gees had sold over 220 million records, won 5 Grammys, 2 American Music Awards, and a Brit Award, proof that they were not just a passing craze, but a musical empire. But after the triumphs of Saturday Night Fever and Spirits Having Flown, they had reached a peak no one could repeat. And it was that same light that began to burn them out. As the 1980s dawned, an anti-disco backlash swept across America. Those who once danced to Staying Alive now mocked disco as shallow, gaudy, and fake. The Disco Sucks movement turned violent. Records were burned in Chicago stadiums. Radio stations publicly banned Bee Gees songs, and the press ridiculed them as sequined relics. Overnight, the heroes became villains. Barry, Robin, and Maurice watched their names vanish from the airwaves, the charts, and public favor. For Barry, the man whose songs had once united the world, the fall was more than a commercial loss. It was a spiritual blow. He withdrew from the spotlight, rarely appearing in public, haunted by the feeling that maybe his talent had only been loved for a moment. Depression crept in during the silent nights when the house was so still he could hear his own heartbeat. Within the band, small fractures deepened. Robin and Maurice wanted to explore softer pop-rock directions, while Barry sought to preserve the Bee Gees' soul through a more contemporary R&B sound. They all still loved music, but no longer agreed on how to protect it. Each carried private wounds from the fall, and studio arguments often dissolved into months of silence. The Bee Gees survived, but the vibrant brotherhood of old was fading. Legal troubles followed. Young artists accused them of plagiarism, claiming their disco hits borrowed too heavily from earlier works. The Western press, once their greatest ally, fed on bizarre rumors that Barry suffered paranoia, that Robin was obsessed with the band's collapse, that Maurice drank to forget. Though most of it was baseless, the relentless scrutiny drove them deeper into isolation. Silence became their only defense. Amid the turmoil, Barry never stopped writing, but now for others. Between 1981 and 1983, he worked behind the scenes, composing and producing for the biggest names in music. Guilty for Barbra Streisand, Grammy, 1981. Heartbreaker for Dionne Warwick, and Islands in the Stream for Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton. Billboard #1, 1983. 1983. Each song bore Barry's unmistakable signature: lush melody, tight structure, and emotional precision. Proof that even if the public turned away, his genius could not be erased. Still, the wounds of fame healed slowly. Robin and Maurice, though reunited with Barry, carried quiet doubts. Were they still the Bee Gees of their youth? Or merely session players in the orbit of Barry Gibb, the lonely genius trying to save himself from despair? The question was never spoken aloud, but it hung in the air, shadowing every track they recorded through the 1980s. Then, in 1988, tragedy struck. Andy Gibb, the youngest brother, died at 30 from myocarditis, brought on by years of addiction and depression. To the world, it was the loss of a rising star. To Barry, it was an unhealable wound. He had mentored Andy, guided his career, and cherished him as the family's pride. When Andy spiraled downward, no one could reach him. The news came just 5 days after Andy's birthday, and Barry nearly collapsed. He blamed himself. "I could have saved him," a verdict that never left his heart. That pain became Wish You Were Here on the 1989 album One, a farewell to the brother who never came back. Barry's voice was rough, heavy with grief. When the song played, listeners didn't just hear music. They heard the silence of the 3 remaining brothers singing to the one who was gone. From then on, in every melody Barry wrote, there was always an empty space where Andy still lived, just on the other side of the sound. After the shock of losing his youngest brother, Barry grew calmer, no longer chasing glory, only wanting to keep what remained of his family close. In 1991, the Bee Gees quietly but steadily returned with High Civilization. Around that time, the brothers lost their father, Hugh Gibb. For Barry, it was the second great loss after Andy. He once said, "Losing my father was losing the first drumbeat of my life," because it was his father who first ignited their love for music. From that grief, the Bee Gees kept writing, with a more measured, restrained energy. Still Waters, 1997. Rich with mature soul and ballad influences, sold over 5 million copies worldwide, marking a remarkable comeback after years of being dismissed as outdated. The song alone sounded like the confession of a man who had lost too much, yet kept moving forward. That same year, they received the Brit Award for Outstanding Contribution to Music, a tribute to more than 3 decades of dedication. Behind the spotlight, however, Barry's health began to decline. In 1998, he was hospitalized with acute stomach inflammation and stress, the cost of years lived under relentless pressure. He became both leader and caretaker as Robin and Morris also began facing health problems. By then, the Bee Gees was no longer the explosive band of the 1970s. It was a family holding on to one another through each song, each remaining night on stage. In 2001, they released This Is Where I Came In, their final studio album. The title track felt like a sad prophecy. This is where I came in, and also where the journey would soon close. The three brothers looked back on their path, no longer chasing trends, only wanting to say thank you to the audience and to each other. Then, in 2003, tragedy struck again. Maurice Gibb, the spiritual twin of Barry, died suddenly from complications after surgery. The blow nearly destroyed Barry. He stopped performing, retreated from public life for years, saying he had lost half his soul and that music is no longer joy. For him, the Bee Gees had not just disbanded, it had died with Maurice. After losing Maurice, Barry grew quieter, living inside his memories. Perhaps because he knew too well what it meant to lose someone you love, not only within his family, but from much earlier in life. Long before fame, before the world knew the name Bee Gees, Barry had a short-lived marriage with Maureen Bates, the first woman who made him believe that love could be an anchor in unstable years. They met in the mid-1960s, when the Bee Gees were still struggling to find their place in Australia. Maureen was gentle, grounded, and one of the few who wasn't dazzled by the vague glow surrounding Barry's music. When he was still playing tiny venues and writing songs in a shabby rented room, she quietly believed in him. Not because of fame, but because she saw the light in the way he spoke about melodies. They married in 1966, when Barry was just 19. It was a simple wedding. No lavish dress, no spectacle. Only the youthful belief of two people trying to start over with empty hands. But the marriage came too early, and fame came too fast. Only months after their wedding, the Bee Gees broke through in Australia with Spicks and Specks, then were invited back to England. The career took off. The love, never fully rooted, was dragged along by the speed of tours and flights. As the Bee Gees became a sensation in London, Barry was consumed by a relentless schedule, while Maureen was left behind, waiting in silence. They had no children and slowly drifted into two separate worlds, one of spotlight, one of quiet loneliness. Short calls and long empty nights turned the marriage into a burden. By 1970, when the Bee Gees reached their first major peak with How Can You Mend a Broken Heart?, Barry understood the title all too well. His marriage to Maureen ended quietly. No scandal, no public accusations, just two young people who had loved each other at a time when their world was too small to carry such enormous dreams. From that breakup, Barry began to understand. Love, like music, cannot survive if one person is always running ahead while the other is left standing still. He carried that emptiness into the songs that followed, melodies sweet yet tinged with a nameless sorrow, the way he remembered Maureen. No longer a lover, but forever the first witness to a genius who had not yet grown up. The collapse of his marriage to Maureen left Barry in one of the emptiest periods of his life. Caught between rising fame and a shattered heart, he returned to London and threw himself into work to forget. But deep down, the fear remained that he would end up alone again, like that moment when the stage lights go out and only silence remains. Then fate appeared, not in a studio or on stage, but backstage at Top of the Pops in 1967. In the crowd of performers, Barry met Linda Gray, a Scottish former Miss Edinburgh with an elegance that was strong yet understated, and a quiet softness he thought he had lost forever. Linda didn't look at Barry as a star. She saw a man carrying too many wounds, and perhaps it was that calm in her gaze that made him stop running. They talked, laughed, and began to write a new chapter. Not loud, not staged, just the quiet connection of two souls mature enough to understand the value of stillness. On September 1st, 1970, Barry's 24th birthday, they married. A beautiful coincidence, like a destined blessing. The day he was born became the day he found the person who would walk with him through the rest of his life. This marriage had no haste, no media circus, only ripened love and trust. While other bands tore themselves apart in the fire of fame, Barry and Linda chose distance from the noise, building a life in a seaside home, raising 5 children: Stephen, Ashley, Travis, Michael, and Alexandra. Linda became Barry's one true anchor when the storms came. From the disco sucks backlash to Andy's death, to the years he battled depression and illness. When the world called him a genius, she simply called him my husband. The man who woke up early to make her coffee, then stepped out onto the balcony to write songs. It was Linda who helped Barry stay balanced, to remain himself amid colossal fame and private grief. But even this happiness was not entirely peaceful. Work pressure, constant touring, and Barry's periods of emotional crisis pushed their marriage to the brink more than once. Linda was exhausted, watching her husband unable to stop working, unable to stop blaming himself. She told friends, "Barry carries the sadness of the whole family, and sometimes all I can do is watch him endure it." Even so, Linda never left. She understood that this man did not need another audience. He needed a place to sit down. When the lights finally went out in 2003, when Maurice died suddenly during surgery, Barry fell silent. The Bee Gees disbanded forever, and the music world lost one of its greatest symbols. Barry, the man who had written hundreds of timeless songs, suddenly felt lost amid his own melodies. He withdrew to Miami, living quietly in his seaside home with his wife, Linda, rarely making public appearances. In the years that followed, he took on only small production projects, limited collaborations, and devoted most of his time to his family. Chronic arthritis gradually betrayed the hands that had once given life to music. Each time Barry touched the piano keys, a sharp pain shot up his arm, a cruel reminder that time was reclaiming what it had once given. Those same hands that wrote, "How deep is your love?" and made millions cry with "Staying Alive," now trembled in dim light, unable to hold a chord steady. But Barry knew the physical pain was only the surface. What truly drained him was the silence that had enveloped him since losing the brothers who once shared his voice. Robin, his twin in music, his partner in every note and breath for nearly half a century, fell ill in 2011 with liver cancer. It spread quickly, and no miracle came. Barry visited the hospital every day, sitting by Robin's bed in silence, sometimes just holding his hand, afraid that letting go would mean losing him forever. And when the voice that once sang "I Started a Joke" went quiet in 2012, Barry knew that a part of himself had died too. At Robin's funeral, the air was thick with grief. Barry stood before the coffin, frail and aged by years within months. When he spoke, the hall fell silent. He was no longer an artist or an icon, just a brother mourning another. "I'm now the last BG," he said softly. "There's no one left for me to sing with." That sentence felt like a farewell to life itself. From then on, every time Barry appeared in public, he wasn't performing for applause. He was singing to speak with the souls he had lost. He called music a conversation with the past, a place where he could still hear Robin's laughter, Maurice's voice, and Andy's faint echo outside the studio door. In Immortality, the song the Bee Gees wrote for Celine Dion in 1997, Barry had once seen only a ballad about legacy and life beyond time. But after his brothers' deaths, it became haunting. When Dion sang "We Don't Say Goodbye," Barry heard Robin and Maurice harmonizing behind her, as if they were still there with him, just in another world. Then came "I Started a Joke," the mournful ballad Robin had first sung in 1968. After Robin's passing, Barry began performing it again at memorials. He often choked on the chorus, because to him it wasn't a song anymore. It was a confession, the confession of an elder brother who had survived them all, but could never escape the pain that survival brought. Each time he performed "To Love Somebody" or "How Can You Mend a Broken Heart," Barry would pause briefly, as if listening for Andy's voice to answer. For him, those songs weren't just memories, they were how he kept his family alive in the world's memory. It's said there exists one final recording, never released, made by Andy Gibb just months before his death. According to a close family friend, Andy sent it only to Barry as a final message. For over 3 decades, Barry has never shared it or let anyone hear. He keeps the master tape locked in a safe, not out of fear of loss, but fear of letting the world touch something too sacred. In 2009, Barry was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, the highest honor a songwriter can receive. But he arrived in a simple black suit, spoke little, bowed his head, and mentioned only his brothers. And in 2016, when his mother, Barbara, passed away, it marked the end of the first generation of the Gibb family. Barry quietly said, "I'm the last leaf left on the tree." Since then, every song he writes, every note he sings, is no longer a performance. It's a ritual of remembrance. For Barry Gibb, music has transcended art itself. It has become a way for the living to speak to the dead, a way for one solitary soul to keep singing. Not for the world, but for the voices that have gone forever silent. In the years that followed, Barry no longer lived like a star. He lived like the keeper of a temple, one filled with memories, echoes, and the spirits of those who still lingered within every note. His Miami home was not noisy or ostentatious. It was quiet, like a studio whose lights had gone out, but where the faint hum of old recordings still floated in the air. Each morning, Barry would step onto the balcony overlooking the sea, tea in hand, and listen, only to the wind. The only thing left that still knew how to sing with him. After the deaths of Robin, and later his mother Barbara, in 2016, Barry became the last survivor of an entire generation. He once compared himself to the last leaf left on the tree, trembling in the wind, yet still green, still alive, for one reason only: to keep a promise to those who were gone. From then on, he no longer wrote music to chase hits. Every song he sang, every melody he touched, became a prayer, a way to call the names of loved ones the world had forgotten. When performing Immortality, he would close his eyes for a long moment during the chorus. "We don't say goodbye." No one knew if he was thinking of Celine Dion, of Robin, or of himself, the man now singing all three harmony parts alone. For Barry, music was no longer work. It was ritual, a space where the living could speak to the dead. Since 2017, Barry has rarely appeared in public, only occasionally performing at tributes to the Bee Gees. Each time he walks onto the stage, the audience rises, not only to honor a legend, but because they know the man before them carries the memory of 3 lives on his shoulders. His performances, though raspy and trembling, leave the world in silence. For within every breath, people can hear the loneliness of a man who lost his entire family to music. Barry Gibb's legacy cannot be measured in Grammys, sales, or awards. He is one of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century, having written more than 1,000 songs, creating timeless melodies for the Bee Gees, Barbra Streisand, Dolly Parton, Kenny Rogers, Diana Ross, and more. Yet what matters most is that he stands as proof of a rare truth in show business. Legends are not born from glory, but from loss, and from the choice to keep singing instead of collapsing under it. Barry Gibb's life has been a strange journey between triumph and solitude, a life where the stage lights shone so brightly that the man who created them was slowly burned away by their glow. From a poor boy on the Isle of Man, he rose to become a musical genius, the man who gave a generation its soundtrack. But for all his fame, he watched his family fall apart. One voice after another fading into silence, until only he remained, the last leaf on the tree. At nearly 80, Barry Gibb no longer needs anyone to call him a legend. He only wishes to be remembered as a brother, a husband, a father, a man who loved music with all his soul and loved his family so deeply that he turned pain into melody. The songs he left behind, "How Deep Is Your Love to Love Somebody," "I Started a Joke," "Immortality," are not just music. They are pages from the diary of a heart once broken, yet still beating. Perhaps Barry's true strength does not lie in his songwriting or his legendary falsetto, but in his courage to keep living, to keep singing, to face memories that others would rather bury. And that is what has made him something music rarely creates: a symbol of loyalty, of remembrance, and of love that never fades. When the final notes of Immortality fade away, we hear not only Barry Gibb's voice, but also the echoes of his 3 brothers, of an era long gone, and of one enduring truth: that love and music, when born from the heart, truly are immortal. Barry Gibb is not merely a man who told stories through melodies. He is the guardian of a past, singing for those who can no longer sing, and living for the dreams left unfinished by an entire family. And you, when you listen again to "How Deep Is Your Love" or "I Started a Joke," do you still feel as if those voices are whispering somewhere around you? If Barry Gibb's story touched you, leave a comment saying, "I love Barry," to honor the last brother of the Bee Gees, and share the song or memory that keeps their music alive in your heart.